A lone delivery driver navigates a desolate stretch of road, the hum of his engine and the faint glow of dashboard lights the only things keeping him company. As the night deepens, the familiar route begins to shift, unmarked roads, an eerie stillness, and the unsettling feeling of being drawn toward something unknown presses in. His GPS guides him toward an abandoned house, its decaying silhouette emerging from the darkness. One final delivery awaits, but as the driver approaches, the air thickens with unease, and the house reveals its true nature, a darkness, a presence, far worse than he ever expected. The hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence as the night enveloped the small, forgotten town. The dashboard lights flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow on the delivery driver's face. He was exhausted, his eyes barely staying open as he drove down the long, empty stretch of road. It was the last shift of the week, and his mind had already begun to wander. A deep, bone-weary fatigue clung to him, every muscle aching from hours of monotony. His body longed for the comfort of his bed, but there was still one more stop to make, just one more. He checked the GPS on his phone again, though it wasn't necessary. He had driven this route 100 times before, and the familiar roads were now etched into his memory. A few miles down the road, the landscape began to change. The buildings grew sparse, and the streetlights dimmed to nothing more than faint yellow glows in the distance. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time, where the world moved on without noticing. His tired eyes flitted over the dark houses, most of them tucked away behind large, overgrown yards, their windows obscured by heavy curtains. No lights. No signs of life. He sighed and gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, the only company being the soft sound of tires against the worn asphalt. The route had been easy up until now. No issues with traffic, no strange detours, just a string of dull, quiet streets. He had expected it to stay that way, but when the GPS suddenly pinged, announcing his next turn, something about it felt off. The voice from the app seemed almost too abrupt. His thumb hovered over the volume button as he glanced at the next set of instructions, but something in the back of his mind nudged him to keep listening. Turn left, the voice said, flat and emotionless. He took the turn, the headlights slicing through the darkness ahead. The road was narrow, twisting like a snake through dense trees and thick brush. It wasn't a path he had ever taken before. In fact, the area wasn't even on the map in his memory. As he drove deeper into the uncharted territory, unease crept up his spine, and he felt a growing sense of isolation. The air seemed to press against the car, heavy with the scent of damp earth and old wood. There was no sign of civilization here, not a single car in sight. Only the soft rustling of the leaves and the occasional croak of a distant frog disturbed the stillness. Then, just as the driver thought he had reached the end of the road, the GPS directed him to a stop. The screen blinked and the words, "Destination arrived," appeared, followed by the house number. It was too quiet here, too still. He glanced to his right, where a large, weathered wooden gate stood ajar. The house beyond was nearly invisible in the darkness, its outline faint against the blackness of the sky. His headlights revealed nothing more than the faintest glimmer of a roof. No lights. No signs of life. He hesitated for a moment, his foot tapping lightly on the brake. The thought of simply driving past and calling it a night crossed his mind. But he had a job to do. He'd been given a delivery, and if he didn't make it, it would reflect badly on him. He sighed, wishing he could just turn around and head home, but that wasn't an option. He needed the money, needed to finish the shift. With a reluctant sigh, he turned the wheel, pulling the car into the long, winding driveway. The tires crunched over the gravel, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting distorted shadows across the driveway. The house grew closer, its structure slowly becoming visible, though it didn't look like the kind of home someone would choose to live in. It was old, neglected, its once white walls now faded to a dull gray. The paint was chipped, the roof sagging in places, and the windows were covered in grime. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. As he reached the front door, the delivery driver's pulse quickened. He didn't know why, but a strange feeling had settled in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The door was wide open, the dim light from his headlights casting a faint glow inside. There were no signs of life, no movement from within, no sound, not even the faintest hint of someone waiting for their package. He leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, trying to make out any details. Nothing. Just emptiness. A strange feeling washed over him, like he had just stumbled into the heart of something wrong. But he had a job to do. With a deep breath, he climbed out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. He grabbed the package from the passenger seat and made his way up the creaky front steps. The wood groaned under his weight, as though the house itself were alive, reacting to his presence. His breath caught in his throat as the door creaked open wider, seemingly on its own. The air inside the house was cold, and he shivered as he stepped across the threshold. The interior was dark, almost too dark, with only the faintest light from outside casting long shadows against the walls. The smell of old, stale air hit him like a brick wall, musty and sour, as if the house had been sealed off from the world for far too long. The floor beneath his boots creaked loudly with each step, the sound echoing through the hollow spaces. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely a whisper against the silence. His words hung in the air, unanswered. There was no response, no sign of life. It felt like he was intruding into a place that was not meant for visitors. The walls, with their peeling wallpaper and faded photographs, seemed to watch him as he moved deeper into the house. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, and he felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to turn around and walk right back out. But he couldn't. He had to deliver the package. It was part of the job. He walked cautiously down the hallway, the shadows stretching out in all directions. The house was bigger than he'd anticipated, stretching back further into the darkness. As he reached the end of the hall, he noticed a door on the left side, slightly ajar. His gut twisted as he approached it, the faint sound of movement just behind the door. At first, he thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again, shuffling, a faint rustle like someone was inside. Someone was here. He knocked lightly on the door, his knuckles brushing against the old wood. "Delivery," he called again, his voice quivering with uncertainty. He had expected a response, maybe a thank you, or at least a brief acknowledgement. But the silence that followed was deafening. The door remained still, and the soft noise inside ceased. Something wasn't right. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get in the car and drive away before it was too late. But he didn't listen. He never did. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room inside was dim, the light from the hallway barely reaching the far corners. And that's when he saw it. A figure stood motionless in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, and its stillness was unnerving. The only thing that moved was the soft sway of its hands at its sides. The driver's heart raced. His mouth went dry as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't just a delivery anymore. There was something terribly wrong about this place. Someone was waiting. And they weren't happy to see him. The silence hung heavy in the room, thick with tension, as the delivery driver stood frozen in the doorway. His heart pounded violently against his chest, and his mouth went dry. The figure before him was still, unnervingly still, like it was waiting for him to make the first move. A chill ran down his spine as the faintest glimmer of moonlight revealed a part of the figure's silhouette. It wasn't moving, and yet he could feel its presence pressing against him like a physical force, an oppressive weight. The air around him seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. His legs felt like lead, unable to move, but his mind screamed at him to run. Every fiber of his being urged him to step back, to turn and leave before things could escalate any further. But he couldn't. His feet were planted, rooted to the spot by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The room felt like a trap, the walls closing in, but he couldn't pull himself away from the figure. It was as if something beyond his control was keeping him there, forcing him to stay just long enough to understand what was happening. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing, but it was like the air had suddenly turned thick, difficult to inhale. His vision blurred slightly, and for a split second he wondered if this was all some sick joke, a prank gone wrong. Maybe someone had found his delivery information and decided to play with him. He had seen stranger things in his line of work. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a joke. The feeling in his gut, the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach, was something far more real. "Hello." His voice was hoarse, the words barely audible. He tried to push them out louder, but they caught in his throat, trapped by an invisible force. The figure didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his presence. It stood there, unmoving, silent, and yet somehow, he could feel its eyes on him, even though he couldn't see its face. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, reaching out from the corners, clawing their way toward him, wrapping around his legs like invisible hands. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening here. Was he alone in this house, or was this figure just the beginning of something far worse? He took a small step forward, trying to force himself to act. It wasn't rational, but he needed to know what was going on. He couldn't stand the idea of just leaving, of running without figuring out what had drawn him here. It was as if the house itself was pulling him in, urging him to move forward, despite the panic rising within him. The creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet felt like it echoed 100 times, the noise far too loud in the suffocating silence. Each step seemed to take him deeper into the abyss. He was getting closer to the figure now, but his body screamed at him to turn around. He was making a mistake. He had to get out. But then, as if in slow motion, the figure shifted, just slightly. The slightest movement, a twitch of the head, and then it stopped again, returning to its frozen state. The delivery driver stopped dead in his tracks, every muscle tensed, every nerve on edge. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Should he leave? Should he stay? Should he call someone? But the question that kept rising to the forefront of his mind, the one that he couldn't shake, was whether this was real. Was this a dream? A nightmare? The figure in front of him felt so surreal, it was almost impossible to believe he was truly standing here, in this forsaken house, in the middle of the night. The house creaked again, louder this time. He instinctively turned his head toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing there, nothing except more darkness. His skin crawled with the feeling of being watched, not just by the figure in the room, but by something beyond it, something hidden, something that was everywhere. The air felt electric, charged with a presence he couldn't see, but could most definitely feel. The driver blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. For a moment, he thought he saw something flash in the corner of his vision, movement, a blur of motion. He turned his head sharply, his pulse quickening. But there was nothing there. His breath caught in his throat. Was it his imagination playing tricks on him? Or was there something more in this house than he had initially realized? "Look, I just have a delivery." His voice was shaky, weak. The words felt hollow in the vast emptiness of the house. He held the package out in front of him like a lifeline, hoping it would somehow make the situation more manageable. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't move, didn't even acknowledge the package. It just stood there, like a shadow trapped in time, unblinking, unfazed. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until the delivery driver felt his sanity fraying at the edges. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. The house around him felt as though it were shifting, its walls seeming to bend and warp, pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape from. Every part of him screamed to leave, to run back to the safety of the outside world, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He was paralyzed, trapped in this house with a figure that was beyond his understanding. Then, something changed. The faintest sound broke the silence, a whisper, low and unintelligible. His body stiffened, his eyes darting around the room, trying to locate the source of the sound. The figure hadn't moved, but the whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from all around him, as though the house itself was speaking to him. The driver felt his stomach churn, a wave of nausea hitting him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't normal. This wasn't real. The world felt like it was slipping away, like the very fabric of reality was fraying at the edges. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. The air was thick with something ancient, something dark. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch out further, as though they were reaching for him, pulling him into their depths. His hands trembled, his grip on the package tightening. He forced himself to take a step back, his body moving on its own, despite the panic clawing at his chest. But as he moved, the figure finally stirred. A slight shift in its posture, the slow, deliberate turn of its head. It wasn't fast, but it was enough to make the driver's blood run cold. The figure's face was still obscured in shadows, but now, the space between them seemed to shrink. He could feel it now, feel the weight of the eyes that watched him from beneath the darkness. The whispering grew louder, almost mocking, like the house itself was laughing at him, playing with him. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't. The feeling of being trapped, of being cornered by something he couldn't see, was overwhelming. The shadows closed in, and all at once, the figure moved. It wasn't a lunge, not a sudden movement, just a slow, deliberate step toward him. The pace was unnerving in its calmness, the intention behind it clear. The figure was not in a hurry, and that made the driver's skin crawl more than anything. It was as if it knew he couldn't escape, that there was nowhere to run. His hand gripped the package harder, his body trembling. The figure took another step forward. And then another. The delivery driver's breath caught in his throat as his brain screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, frozen in place by the unrelenting gaze of the figure, whatever it was, whatever it wanted. It was getting closer. And then, just as the driver thought he might lose control, the figure stopped. Just stopped. It was as if the world itself had paused, the silence pressing down on him, heavier than ever. The figure stood mere feet away now, and in the darkness, its eyes glowed faintly, a cold, predatory gleam that sent a shiver through the driver's entire body. He knew, without a doubt, that he had crossed into something far beyond his understanding. The rules of the world didn't apply here. The figure wasn't human, not anymore, and whatever it wasn't interested in a package. It was interested in him. The delivery driver stood paralyzed, staring at the figure in front of him. The darkness in the room seemed to press in on all sides, suffocating him with its weight. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and erratic, but everything else, the creaks of the house, the whispers, had fallen away. The air felt colder now, unnaturally cold, as if the room itself was absorbing all the warmth, leaving him standing in a frozen void. His hands, slick with sweat, clutched the package tighter. He wanted to throw it, to escape, to do anything that would get him out of this nightmare, but his body wouldn't obey. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure, still standing in the same place, hadn't made another move, but there was something in the stillness of its posture that made the driver feel as though the very space around him was closing in. He felt like he was being slowly encased, the walls of the house folding in around him, locking him inside. The faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of light from the hallway did little to break the oppressive darkness. He could barely see the figure now, but it didn't matter. He could feel its presence, like a weight on his chest, a pressure in the air, a promise of something that wasn't quite human. The whispering started again, low and unintelligible, curling around him like smoke, filling the empty spaces of his mind. It wasn't coming from the figure, it wasn't even coming from the room anymore. It seemed to come from everywhere, from inside his head, from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. The sound was soft, almost soothing, but there was a chilling undertone to it, like an ancient language that had no place in the world of the living. It scraped against his mind, pulling at the edges of his thoughts, threatening to unravel him. The driver clenched his teeth, trying to push the sound away, but it was impossible. The whispers were everywhere, drowning him in their presence. He took a step back, then another, his feet moving instinctively, his mind still racing, still trying to make sense of what was happening. But with every step he took, the space around him seemed to shift. The walls felt like they were stretching, warping, bending in on themselves. The room wasn't the same room anymore. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to him, to his fear, feeding off it. He could feel the floor under his feet tilt slightly, the air growing even colder, and for a moment he thought he might fall, might be pulled into the darkness. The door he had come through, now so far away, seemed to vanish, the hallway swallowed by shadows. He glanced toward the figure, and for the first time, he saw it move, slowly, deliberately, almost as though it were savoring the moment. The movement was unnatural, like it didn't quite belong in the world. It wasn't a step, not quite. It was more like a shift, as if the figure was gliding rather than walking, the air around it warping as it moved. The driver's breath hitched, and his chest tightened, the fear clamping around his ribs. He didn't know what it was, but whatever it wasn't human. Not anymore. He could feel it deep in his bones. The thing in front of him had once been something else, something that had crossed over, something that didn't belong here. The figure raised its arm, slowly, and the movement seemed to drag the air itself along with it, like a wave of heavy, oppressive energy rippling through the space. The driver could see the outline of its hand, but it was too dark to make out any details. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any sound, but the whispering grew louder, more intense, filling his mind with images, flashes of things he couldn't quite grasp. They were there, just beyond his reach, like broken fragments of a nightmare. Faces, twisted, contorted, pale eyes staring at him, mouths open in silent screams. He felt his stomach churn as the images assaulted him, his mind struggling to piece them together, but the pieces didn't fit. He closed his eyes, trying to block them out, but they only grew stronger, more vivid. He staggered backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His eyes flew open, desperate to find something solid, something real to focus on. But when he looked up, the figure was closer now, much closer, standing only a few feet away, its outstretched hand hovering just inches from him. He could feel the air around him crackle with an unnatural energy, like static before a storm. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and he shivered, unable to stop it, his teeth chattering as the cold seeped into his bones. The figure's face, if it could even be called that, remained hidden in shadow, but there was something in the way it moved, in the way it stood, that made it feel wrong. Its presence was like a heavy, suffocating cloud, and the driver felt like he was being crushed by it, like the very air around him was too thick to breathe. There was a pressure, a weight on his chest, pushing him down, pinning him in place. He opened his mouth to scream, to call out, but no sound came. His throat had closed up, his voice swallowed by the suffocating silence that had fallen over the room. The whispers in his head intensified, becoming more frantic, like a dozen voices speaking at once, all clawing to be heard. They were pleading, crying out, but the driver couldn't understand them. It was all noise, a jumble of disjointed words and phrases, nothing coherent. His mind swirled with the chaos, and he felt himself slipping, like he was losing control of his own thoughts. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything seemed to spin. He could hear his own ragged breathing, could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, and it seemed like the walls were pressing in on him, suffocating him. He fought to keep his composure, but it was getting harder. The fear was too much, the darkness too overwhelming. The figure took another step forward. Its hand was now mere inches from his face, and the air around it felt thick with malevolent energy. The driver could feel it, a heavy pressure pressing down on his skin, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching him. He felt something cold brush against his cheek, and for a split second he thought he might pass out. The touch was icy, unnatural, and it sent a jolt of panic through his body. He recoiled, stumbling back, but his feet tangled, and he fell to the floor with a thud. He scrambled to get up, his hands shaking, his chest tightening with each breath. He pushed himself to his feet, but before he could move, the figure spoke. Its voice was not what he expected. It wasn't a whisper, but it was cold, distorted, as though it was coming from far away, from some place that didn't belong in this world. The words it spoke were familiar, but twisted. "Why did you come here?" the voice asked, and the driver's blood ran cold. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. It knew why he was here. It knew everything. The room seemed to close in even more, the shadows creeping along the walls, bending and stretching, closing in on him like a vice. He tried to move, tried to run, but his body was paralyzed, trapped by the weight of the figure's presence, by the suffocating darkness that filled the room. He could feel the walls pressing in around him, pushing him toward the figure, toward whatever it was that awaited him. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. He was trapped. And as the figure took another step closer, the whispering in his mind reached a crescendo, drowning out all other sound. The last thing the driver heard, before everything went black, was the faint sound of a door creaking open somewhere far in the distance, like the final note in a song, a sound that promised an end to everything. The driver's mind was spinning, a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. The cold touch of the figure's hand still lingered on his cheek, the icy sensation seeping into his skin as if the touch had somehow marked him. Every breath he took felt labored, like the very air had turned to lead, too thick to breathe. His heart was racing in his chest, each beat like a loud drum in the silence of the room, pounding in his ears. The darkness around him seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, making the space feel smaller with every passing second. The shadows stretched and writhed, twisting in unnatural shapes, like they were alive, reacting to his fear. He tried to steady himself, to push against the overwhelming sensation of dread that had taken root deep in his bones, but it was impossible. The figure before him remained still, watching him with its featureless face, its cold, unblinking eyes hidden in shadow. But its presence, was more than enough to know it was watching, observing every tremor of fear that racked his body. There was something suffocating about the stillness in the room, as if the very air had turned heavy with anticipation. Each second stretched, slow and unbearable, like time itself had stopped, leaving him suspended in this moment of dread. He wanted to scream, to yell out for help, but his throat was tight, constricted as though invisible hands were wrapping around it, squeezing the sound out of him before it could escape. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the tension in the room continued to build, growing thicker with every passing moment. It was as though the silence was waiting for him to make the next move, to do something, anything, that might break the stalemate between them. But the driver couldn't think, couldn't process the situation. His mind was a blur of panic, confusion, and the desperate need to escape. He couldn't even remember how he had ended up in this place. The house, the figure, the oppressive weight of the air, it all felt like a nightmare, a bad dream he couldn't wake from. He tried to move again, his legs shaking beneath him, his body trembling with the strain of standing in this suffocating room. But as soon as he shifted, the floorboards creaked beneath his feet, and a cold gust of air seemed to rush through the room, sending a shiver down his spine. The temperature plummeted, and he could see his breath mist in front of him, a fog of cold that matched the chill settling deep in his chest. The house felt like it was alive, like it was reacting to him, pushing him deeper into its clutches. It felt wrong, unnatural, as if the walls themselves were closing in, as if the house was drawing him in, holding him captive. The air was so thick with fear now that it felt almost solid, pressing against his skin, making it difficult to breathe. The driver's gaze flickered back to the figure, and he noticed, for the first time, a subtle shift. The figure hadn't moved, but there was something in the way it loomed, something that felt like it was drawing closer, like the space between them was shrinking. His breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, instinctively trying to create distance, but the floor beneath him seemed to move, buckling slightly under his weight, as if the very ground was shifting beneath him. The room seemed to stretch, the walls bending and warping, the dimensions of the space no longer following the laws of reality. It felt as though the room was no longer a room at all but a living, breathing thing, one that was reacting to him, to his fear, pulling him deeper into its grip. Every sound now felt amplified, every creak of the floor, every rustle of the air, as if the house was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. The whispers, which had been faint at first, now filled the room, rising in intensity, growing louder and clearer, until they were no longer whispers at all. They were voices, hundreds of them, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, their words swirling around him, pressing against his mind, their meaning slipping just out of reach. The voices were desperate, pleading, crying out for something. But for what, he couldn't say. The feeling that there was something more, something beyond the figure, beyond the house itself, gnawed at him, scratching at the edges of his consciousness. The pressure in the room grew unbearable. It felt as though something was trying to crawl inside his head, to take root in his thoughts, to infect his mind. The shadows seemed to twist and move, the darkness itself shifting and stretching in unnatural ways. The whispering voices grew louder, their words becoming clearer, but still incomprehensible. The driver felt his thoughts start to unravel, the strings of his sanity slipping away like sand through his fingers. The darkness seemed to seep into his mind, clouding his thoughts, twisting his perceptions. He could no longer tell what was real and what was imagined. Every step he took felt like he was sinking deeper into this nightmare, the walls of the house pressing in tighter, the air thickening until it felt impossible to breathe. In a desperate attempt to shake the feeling of suffocation, the driver tried to force his legs to move, to make a break for the door. His body screamed in protest, but his mind was flooded with a single thought: escape. He had to get out of here. He turned, his feet slipping on the cold floor, but before he could make it more than a few steps, the figure moved. It wasn't fast, not like he expected. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator savoring the chase. The figure's feet didn't touch the floor. Instead, it glided across the room, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. The driver froze, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. It wasn't just the figure anymore. It was the entire house, closing in on him, pulling him toward the center of it, as if there was no escape. The figure stopped, just inches from him, its shadow stretching across the floor, stretching over him, swallowing him whole. The air around him crackled with an energy he couldn't understand, but it felt cold and alive, like something was reaching out to touch him from beyond the veil of reality. His breath hitched, his chest tightening with fear. He could feel the weight of the figure's presence, even though he couldn't see its face. There was something intangible about it, something that made his skin crawl, as though it wasn't just standing in front of him, it was inside him, in his thoughts, in his very being. "Why are you here?" The figure's voice came, low and gravelly, distorted in a way that made it sound almost alien. The words didn't sound like they came from a human mouth. They felt like they were being spoken by something else, something ancient, something beyond understanding. The driver's mouth went dry, his mind racing for a response, but no words came. The figure's voice had paralyzed him, frozen him in place, as if the very sound of it had stolen his ability to speak. It didn't wait for him to answer. The figure simply tilted its head slightly, as though observing him, studying him, and then, without warning, it moved again. This time, it didn't glide or shift. It lunged, but not with the speed of something alive. It was more like it dissolved into the space between them, its form becoming a part of the shadows, its movements unpredictable and unnatural. The driver staggered backward, his feet slipping against the slick floor, his mind spiraling into terror as the figure's presence enveloped him. The room began to pulse, the shadows thickening, wrapping around him like a cocoon. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with a maddening cacophony of voices. They were no longer words, but something worse, raw, primal sounds that gnawed at his sanity, driving him to the edge of his limits. His thoughts began to fracture, breaking apart under the pressure. The house was no longer just a house. It was alive, breathing, watching, waiting for something. Something that was coming for him, something that had been waiting for him all along. The darkness around him pressed closer, and the figure seemed to dissolve into the air itself, its presence everywhere, surrounding him. The driver felt himself falling, his vision blurring as the room spun around him. His knees buckled and he collapsed to the floor, unable to hold himself up anymore. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped in this place, in this nightmare, with no way out. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the sound of the whispers rising into a single, deafening chorus, a sound that drowned out everything else, consuming him entirely. The driver's eyes snapped open, his body jolting upright as though he had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. But as he gasped for air, he quickly realized he was still trapped in the same dark, oppressive room. The floor beneath him felt cold and uneven, the air still thick with the suffocating weight of dread. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He had fallen, he knew that much. But how much time had passed? Was it minutes? Hours? His mind struggled to piece together the events, but they felt fragmented, like bits of a broken puzzle scattered beyond his reach. He tried to move, to stand, but his limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. His body ached as though he had been lying in the same position for far too long, muscles stiff and unresponsive. He gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to cooperate, and slowly, shakily, he managed to push himself up. The room around him seemed unchanged, dark, suffocating, the shadows still stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. The figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence lingered, like a cold stain in the air. He could feel it, could sense it, as though the very fabric of the house had been altered by its existence, as though it were still watching him, even though he could no longer see it. His heart pounded in his chest, and he swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing thoughts. What was this place? What had happened to him? He staggered forward, his vision blurred, the edges of his world spinning as he fought to keep his balance. The shadows in the room seemed to move with him, following him, closing in on him. It was as though the house itself were alive, aware of his every step, anticipating his every movement. The whispers, those maddening whispers, had returned. At first, they were faint, like distant murmurs from another room, but they were growing louder, their words becoming clearer, sharper. He couldn't make sense of them, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, desperate, as though they were calling out to him, trying to warn him, or perhaps lure him further into the darkness. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with an unseen rhythm, a low hum that vibrated through the floor, through his bones. He could feel it in his chest, a deep resonance that made his teeth ache. The air was thick and oppressive, every breath harder to take than the last, as though the house were suffocating him, slowly, deliberately. He tried to ignore it, to push forward, but his instincts screamed at him to turn around, to flee, to escape before it was too late. But where could he go? There was nowhere to run. As he stumbled toward the hallway, he glanced around, searching for anything that might offer a hint of escape. The front door, his only exit, was still visible, but it felt impossibly far away, as though it had been pushed back into another dimension, out of reach. The walls had seemed to shift, stretch, and warp as he moved, as though the house itself was rearranging its rooms, its passages, twisting the very space around him. He had no idea how long he had been in this place, but it felt like hours, or maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning here. He reached out for the doorframe, his hand trembling as he steadied himself, but just as his fingers brushed against the wood, he heard a sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. His breath caught in his throat. He stopped dead in his tracks, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, methodical, as though whoever was making them was walking in time with his own heartbeat. The sound echoed through the house, reverberating in the walls, as if the very building itself was amplifying the noise. He held his breath, his body tensing as the footsteps grew closer. They were coming for him, he realized. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The figure, the thing that had been watching him, it was here, and it was moving toward him. He turned his head sharply, his eyes scanning the dim hallway, but there was no one there. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, swallowing up the narrow passage before him. But the footsteps, those slow, deliberate footsteps, were getting closer, closer still. He forced himself to move, his legs shaking beneath him, each step a struggle, but he couldn't stop. He had to get away. He had to find a way out. His eyes darted from side to side, but the hallway was empty. At least, it seemed empty. The shadows seemed to grow darker, deeper, more oppressive the further he went, and with each step he took, the whispers grew louder. The voices were more frantic now, their tone rising with urgency. He could almost make out words now, fragments of sentences, but they were disjointed, broken. Something about them gnawed at his mind, scraping at his thoughts like a fingernail against glass. His pulse quickened, his breathing ragged. Every instinct told him to run, to escape this nightmare, but the house, this place, seemed to be closing in around him. It was like he was walking through a labyrinth, each turn leading him deeper into its grip. The walls of the hallway felt as though they were moving, subtly shifting, pushing him in one direction, forcing him to go further into the house. The darkness was all-consuming now, filling every corner, wrapping around him, pressing down on him, making it impossible to breathe. It felt like the house was alive and aware of him. He could feel its malevolent gaze upon him, as though it was watching his every move, anticipating his every step. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, coming closer with every passing second. They were right behind him now, the sound echoing in his ears, but when he turned around, nothing. The hallway remained empty, the shadows hanging heavy in the air. But he could still hear them, hear the footsteps, hear the shuffling of movement behind him, as if something or someone was there, just beyond his vision. His mind screamed at him to turn and run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He could barely move at all, his body frozen in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. Then a sound cut through the air, a soft creak, followed by a low, almost imperceptible growl. It came from the darkness ahead, and it was enough to send a cold shiver of terror down his spine. The growl wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, animalistic. Something unnatural. He froze again, his heart pounding in his chest, as the air around him seemed to grow heavier, the darkness pressing in from all sides. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but every path forward seemed blocked. There was no way out. The house had him trapped. He was inside it now, deep inside, and the walls were closing in, tightening their grip around him. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. His vision swam, and his legs buckled again, sending him to his knees. He struggled to stay conscious, to keep his wits about him, but it was growing harder. The whispers were everywhere now, filling his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. The footsteps, the growls, they were closing in. And then, without warning, the darkness exploded into movement. A figure, no, figures, appeared in the shadows, emerging from the walls themselves, as though they had been waiting for him. They were tall, shadowy figures, their forms shifting and writhing in unnatural ways. Their faces, if they could even be called faces, were twisted, contorted, like grotesque masks. And their eyes were empty, black voids, staring directly into his soul, as though they were pulling him into them, drawing him deeper into the darkness. The growl echoed again, this time louder, a warning, a command. He felt himself being pulled toward them, against his will, as though the very house itself was dragging him into its depths. The shadows closed in tighter, and he felt himself slipping into the blackness, his vision fading as the weight of the house, the weight of the figures, bore down on him. He was trapped, pulled into the abyss. There was no escape, no way out. And as he lost consciousness, the last thing he heard was the growl, louder now, closer, before everything went black. The driver's mind slowly began to come back to him. At first, it was only a faint stir, like the hum of a far-off memory, something just out of reach, something that barely registered. He opened his eyes, squinting against the dim light that seemed to crawl across the walls like a living thing. The room around him was blurry at first, disjointed, but as his senses sharpened, he began to recognize where he was. It wasn't the hallway anymore. It wasn't the living room. It was different. The space felt confined, claustrophobic, like the walls themselves were pressing in on him, forcing him into submission. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, like his body was weighed down by something he couldn't see. Panic surged in his chest, but it was sluggish, a slow-burning fear, not the sharp spike of terror he had felt before. He tried to sit up, but the moment he shifted, the room seemed to spin. His stomach churned, a nauseous wave rising in his throat, but he forced himself to focus. The air was thick here, too thick to be natural, and it carried with it a faint, sour odor, something like stale dust mixed with decay. The floor beneath him was rough, uneven, and cold, biting into his skin with each movement. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the wall, and the moment they touched, he felt a tremor run through the structure, a ripple of something unnatural, like the house was alive, reacting to his touch. He pulled his hand back, confused, but his head spun, and for a moment, the room tilted wildly again. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the vertigo to stop, and when he opened them again, the world seemed to steady itself. His vision was still blurry around the edges, but the feeling of being trapped, of being held down by invisible hands, was unmistakable. The walls of the room felt as though they were closing in, slowly inching toward him. He was in a small, narrow space, maybe a closet? Or a corner of a room, he couldn't be sure. But there was something wrong with it, something unsettling. The shadows in the corners seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, and the floor creaked under the weight of an unseen presence. His breath came in shallow, labored gasps, his chest tight, the pressure of the air around him pushing down on him like a physical force. There were no windows, no sources of light except for the faint glow that seemed to flicker and die out at the edges of the room. It was impossible to tell how long he had been in here. Minutes? Hours? The time felt irrelevant. Time had stopped making sense the moment he stepped foot into this cursed house. He swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts, trying to push past the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to his every movement. Where was he? Where had the figure gone? Had he imagined it? No, he hadn't imagined it. He could still feel the presence of something, someone, nearby. Suddenly, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, like a breeze through leaves, soft and indistinct. But they were there. The voices. He could hear them, clearer now, swirling in the corners of his mind. It wasn't just one voice, not just the figure from before. There were many, hundreds, maybe thousands, each one speaking at once, all at different volumes, but none loud enough to make sense of. The words were jumbled, broken, pieces of sentences slipping through his ears, like fragments of a conversation he couldn't quite catch. It was maddening. His hands trembled as he pressed his palms against his ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was speaking through them, urging him, commanding him, pulling at his sanity. He clutched at his head, trying to push the noise away, but the pressure inside his skull increased with every passing second. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the space shrinking until it felt like he was suffocating, trapped in a box, with no way out. His pulse raced, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, to break free from whatever force was holding him here, but no matter how hard he tried to move, his body refused to cooperate. His limbs felt heavy, like they weren't his own, like they were made of something else, something cold and unfeeling. The air in the room thickened, growing colder, and the whispers turned into a low growl, something deep and guttural, like the sound of an animal prowling in the shadows. The temperature dropped even further, until his breath came out in visible clouds, swirling in front of him like smoke. He could feel it now, the presence closing in on him, drawing nearer, and the growl grew louder, closer. His chest tightened, the fear creeping in, taking hold of him. There was no escape, no way out. The walls of the room had become suffocating, the air like ice, and he could hear the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming toward him. He was no longer alone. He could feel it. The space around him pulsed with an unseen energy, as though something had shifted, something had changed. The footsteps grew louder, and then he saw it. The shadow, moving against the walls, sliding like a wraith through the darkness. His eyes widened in horror as it took form, solidifying into something almost human but twisted, distorted, like a nightmare given flesh. The figure, the thing, was impossibly tall, its body stretched and bent in unnatural angles, its limbs contorted and elongating in ways that defied the laws of nature. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a blur of features, like a jigsaw puzzle whose pieces didn't fit together, an unrecognizable mass of twisted flesh. Its eyes, dark and empty, seemed to bore into him, piercing straight through him. The driver tried to move, tried to scream, but his throat was frozen, his body paralyzed with fear. The figure, no, the creature, took another step forward, and then another, its movements slow, deliberate, as though savoring the fear that radiated from him. It was coming closer, and with each step, the room seemed to close in even tighter, the shadows pressing against him, suffocating him. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, the chill from the creature's proximity wrapping around him like chains, holding him in place. And then it spoke. The voice was not what he expected. It wasn't human, not by any means. It was distorted, guttural, and yet oddly familiar, like a voice he had heard before, a voice that had been hidden in the recesses of his memory, buried deep inside him. The words it spoke were simple, but they hit him like a physical blow. "You shouldn't have come." The sound of its voice made the driver's blood run cold. It wasn't just a voice, it was an echo, a command, a warning. The words reverberated in his mind, bouncing off the walls of his consciousness like they were meant to break him. He tried to move again, to push himself to his feet, but his body remained immobile, held in place by some unseen force. The creature continued to draw closer, its shape shifting in and out of focus, like it was a part of the very shadows themselves. He could feel its cold presence pressing against him, surrounding him, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears as the creature moved ever closer, its empty eyes never leaving his. "Leave now, while you still can," the creature whispered, its voice echoing in his mind, its tone mocking. But there was no escape. He could feel it. The house, the creature, it was all one now. A single entity, drawing him deeper, locking him in place. His thoughts began to fracture, his sanity slipping away like sand through his fingers. He couldn't stay here much longer, not like this. His mind screamed at him to break free, to fight, to do something, anything, but his body refused to respond. The creature took another step forward, and this time, it wasn't a slow, deliberate motion. It was quick, faster than humanly possible, and it was upon him. The cold surrounded him, engulfed him, until he could feel nothing but the darkness, until the shadows seemed to swallow him whole. And in that moment, as the world around him blurred, he knew with a sickening certainty, he was not leaving this place. Not ever. The driver's eyes snapped open, his heart hammering in his chest, but for a moment, it felt as though he had been transported to another place, another time. The room, the house, everything was different. It was no longer that suffocating, oppressive atmosphere that had threatened to swallow him whole. He was in a place of stark, almost sterile silence. The air, though still thick with an unsettling weight, felt slightly warmer, a touch less suffocating. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus his blurry vision, but the disorientation was so complete that he felt as though his mind was still floating, trying to reconnect with reality. For a few moments, he was unable to make sense of what was around him. The walls were smooth, polished wood, bathed in a dim, amber light. The floor was covered with thick, luxurious carpet, the kind that would seem out of place in a house that was as decrepit and decayed as the one he had just escaped. There were no shadows here, no dark corners filled with whispering voices. In fact, the silence was deafening. It felt wrong. There was no movement, no creaking of the house, no subtle shifts in the air. It was as though the very essence of the place had shifted, become something else entirely. He tried to stand but found that his legs were weak, his body shaky, as though he had been asleep for hours, if not longer. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and his fingers fumbled as he reached for the edge of what appeared to be a wooden table next to him. The table was simple, unadorned, yet it looked too clean, too polished, in contrast to the decay that had enveloped the house moments before. Everything here was immaculate, untouched, yet there was still something about the space that made his skin crawl. His mind was still a haze of fragmented thoughts, but one thing was clear: he needed to leave. Something had happened, something that had shaken him to his core, but he couldn't quite grasp what it was. He remembered the figure, the creature, and the suffocating darkness that had clung to him. The weight of its presence had been overwhelming. And yet, as he stood there, in the dimly lit room, he couldn't shake the sense that the house, this new space, was somehow connected to the nightmare he had just endured. His stomach twisted, the feeling of unease growing with each passing second. The room itself felt like a trap. The walls were too clean, too smooth, the light too perfect, casting no shadows, no hints of the world outside. His mind screamed at him to leave, to escape the feeling of being watched, but his body refused to cooperate. He turned slowly, his gaze falling on the only doorway in the room. It was a solid, dark wood door, old but well-maintained, the kind that would normally evoke a sense of security. But here, it felt like a barrier. It felt like the last thing he should be heading toward. With every step he took toward the door, a low hum seemed to build in the air around him. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, but as he approached, it grew louder, more insistent. The sound was coming from the door, vibrating through the very wood itself. He stopped in his tracks, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. It wasn't a normal sound. It wasn't a creak, nor was it the low groan of old wood. It was something deeper, more primal. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very core of the house, a vibration that resonated in his bones. The hum increased in intensity, and his heart began to race once again. His instinct was telling him to turn around, to forget about the door, to find another way out. But something kept pulling him forward. His hand reached for the handle, and as soon as his fingers brushed against it, the temperature in the room plummeted. The chill was immediate, like a wave of ice coursing through his body. His breath misted in front of him, and the air felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere around him had thickened, becoming dense and almost suffocating. He yanked his hand back, his heart pounding in his chest, but before he could react, the door opened, slowly, agonizingly so, as if the house itself was reluctant to allow him to pass. The creaking sound of the door swinging open reverberated through the room, and the cold air from the other side washed over him, making him shiver involuntarily. The hallway beyond was dark, the same oppressive shadows that had filled the house before clinging to every surface. But the darkness was different now. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was an absence, a void, as if something was waiting for him in the blackness. The moment the door was fully open, he heard it. A low, guttural growl, the same sound that had reverberated through the house before, now coming from the depths of the hallway. It was louder this time, more real, as though the creature that had been tormenting him was close, too close. He froze, the hairs on his neck standing up, his heart hammering in his chest. The growl was followed by a heavy, rhythmic thudding, like the sound of something large and slow moving toward him. Each step was deliberate, purposeful. It was coming for him. He couldn't tell from where, but it was definitely moving closer. The driver stood frozen, unable to move, his thoughts racing in every direction. He had to escape. But where? The door was his only option, and yet, the hallway beyond seemed to be filled with some kind of terrible presence, something dark, something ancient. The hum from earlier had intensified, now pulsing in time with his heartbeat, as though it were alive, as though it were aware of his every move. His body screamed at him to run, but his feet felt as if they were cemented to the floor, locked in place by fear. Every instinct in him told him to flee, but he couldn't. He was trapped in this room, trapped in this house, and the presence that was coming for him felt inevitable. He finally took a step forward, his body moving slowly, cautiously, like he was testing the waters, unsure of what would happen next. But the moment his foot hit the ground, the growl echoed louder, closer. A sound like nails scraping against metal followed, and his blood ran cold. The creature was close. He could feel it. It was in the walls, in the very air, and it was moving toward him with a speed he couldn't comprehend. His breathing quickened, and before he could stop himself, he ran. He ran toward the door, toward the hallway, toward whatever fate awaited him. The air seemed to grow thicker with every step, pushing against him, resisting his movement. The darkness ahead seemed to stretch, impossible, infinite, until the hallway felt like it would never end. The growls and scraping noises grew louder, surrounding him, overwhelming him. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he couldn't stop. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. It wasn't a physical shift, not something he could see, but it was as though the very foundation of the house had changed. The floor buckled beneath him, sending him tumbling forward, crashing against the cold, unforgiving surface. His face slammed against the floor, his body aching, his head spinning. He pushed himself up, but his limbs were too weak. The darkness around him thickened, consuming him, and the growls now turned into something worse, a deep, guttural laughter. The sound sent waves of terror through his body, freezing him in place. The presence was so close now, he could almost feel it behind him, breathing down his neck. He turned around, panic rising in his chest, his pulse pounding in his ears. The hallway was still empty, but the oppressive darkness that filled it seemed to be alive, waiting, watching. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the presence receded. The growling stopped. The scraping noise died away. And for a brief, fleeting moment, the air was still. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Someone, was waiting for him, just beyond the door. The laughter rang in his ears, the darkness closing in as he stumbled toward the edge of the abyss. He wasn't sure what was real anymore, what was a nightmare, and what was the truth. But one thing was certain: whatever waited on the other side of that door, he would have to face it. The question was, would he survive? The driver's hand gripped the edge of the doorframe, his body trembling, every nerve alive with a cocktail of fear and confusion. The oppressive silence that had settled in the hallway was broken only by the erratic thumping of his heart in his chest. Every breath he took seemed to carry the weight of the house itself, each inhalation a battle against the suffocating atmosphere that pressed in on him. His eyes flicked nervously between the shadows at the far end of the hall, where the darkness seemed to coil like a living thing, and the door he had just come through. The growling and the scraping had stopped, leaving behind only a strange, pulsing quiet that set his teeth on edge. It was too still, too empty. It felt wrong. His fingers flexed involuntarily, almost as if trying to steady himself, but the sensation in the pit of his stomach told him that he was walking on the edge of something far worse than fear. The faint glow from the hallway lights seemed to fade, the shadows creeping along the floor, inching closer to him as if drawn by some unseen force. He took a cautious step back into the hallway, his feet making no sound against the floor, as though the house was swallowing every movement he made. His thoughts were clouded with panic, but beneath the surface of his fear was something darker, a sense of inevitability, a creeping suspicion that he was too far gone, that there was no escape from whatever it was that lurked inside these walls. The air grew colder still, and the temperature seemed to drop by degrees. His breath misted in the air in front of him, the cold biting at his skin, seeping into his bones. It wasn't natural. Nothing about this place was natural. His body shook involuntarily, but he forced himself to move, his legs stiff and unresponsive. The growl, deep, guttural, and unmistakable, echoed through the hallway again, but this time, it wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from ahead, from further down the hall, from the deeper shadows that waited like a hidden predator. He stopped, frozen in place, as the sound reverberated through the walls, a deep, vibrating growl that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The air around him vibrated with an unsettling energy, and it felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing in time with the ominous sound. He didn't dare to move, not yet, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next, every corner now filled with something he could almost feel watching him. The sense of being observed, of being hunted, was overwhelming. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. Every instinct told him to turn and flee back to the safety of the door, to return to the space he had just come from, but something deeper, something more primal, held him in place. The shadows stretched out before him, coiling around his legs, making each step forward feel like a struggle against invisible hands that tried to drag him back. The closer he got to the end of the hallway, the thicker the darkness became, until it seemed like it was a physical barrier, pressing against him, surrounding him. And then, as if summoned by his hesitation, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, it was just a blur, something indistinct, like smoke or mist. But it grew more solid, more tangible, until it took shape in the dim light. His breath caught in his throat, and his chest tightened. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The figure was tall, towering over him, its form twisted and grotesque, its limbs stretching unnaturally in every direction. Its face, if it could be called a face, was an abomination, a nightmare of contorted features, as though it had once been human but was now something far worse. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring out from the darkness, but despite their emptiness, they seemed to pierce through him, locking onto his very soul. The creature's mouth opened, but there was no sound at first. Only a horrible, slow, sickening creak, as though the very bones of the creature were breaking and bending with every movement. And then the voice came. It was low, gravelly, and distorted, as though it was struggling to speak, struggling to form words that made any sense. But there was a hunger in it, a hunger that was palpable, that seemed to radiate from the thing in waves, almost suffocating him. "You should never have come," the voice rumbled, the words jagged and fractured, as if the creature had to force them out, one syllable at a time. Each word seemed to scrape against his ears, scraping against his mind, wearing away at his sanity.